All right. Good morning, everybody. Let's get started. Welcome to the IoT Tech Talk series, IoTTT. Thanks, Sarab, for pulling it together. And thanks for Deborah Stein for making it possible to come and speak to us. Deborah is an expert on energy and internet, energy and new technology questions and policy in particular, and comes to us after a distinguished career in government, in the actual practitioner area, and now in academia. And she will speak about going beyond security and privacy in the IoT field and what that means for public policy. We met each other last year in a workshop that Vinsurf and Foundation organized to just, kind of scan the horizon of what's out there in terms of IoT, cybersecurity, and policy. And it was a great exchange, and I think everybody left with a little bit better understanding and a little bit more scared and a little bit more optimistic about some of the opportunities out there. And it's great to have you over. If I may ask you to, while you're giving your talk, think about the stuff that is particularly either pointing us to an opportunity or making us aware of a challenge and a risk that we should be aware of. How to facilitate an effective and meaningful governance system for these new spaces, for these new environments that we're looking at when, as we see the Internet of Things emerging. That would be wonderful. There will be time for a couple of questions after the talk, and I'm looking very much forward to hear what you have to share with us. Thank you, Deborah.
Oops. So thanks for inviting me here. I'm going to talk about something, like I think everybody in the IoT world knows about the issues of security and privacy. And so I'm not, even though those are what I would call non-market factors, I'm not going to focus on those because I think you know those already. Those are being covered in many different fronts. So I'm going to first sort of give you some examples of what are non-market factors, the barriers, opportunities, and thinking about what a strategy is. So this is a very simple explanation. So most of the time when you're an engineer, and I'm an engineer myself, so I love engineering, I love technology. I just want to know, does it work? Is it cool? That's really my focus.
I'm
yes.
really sorry, but could you stand relatively close to the mic? Otherwise, the folks on the
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so then on the business side, you're just saying, is there a market for it? But if you're a policymaker or just a society, then you think about other things. For a policymaker, the issue is thinking about the policies that are going to kind of encourage or discourage that technology, and you need to think about that from your new market, new technology commercialization perspective. And so one goal is to influence a policymaker. Another goal is to influence society. Is the society ready to accept the technology? So these forces kind of go both ways. Sometimes they would take actions that would support your new technology. Sometimes they'll take actions that oppose your technology. And sometimes they're neutral. Yes. Okay.
And you do have a mic, so you can walk around. I didn't see it.
Oh, yes, I do have a mic. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to give the autonomous cars an example because it's the simplest example and all of you are familiar with it. So here's an example where this is NHTSA, which is National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, is saying self-driving cars must be able to defeat hackers. And then here is Google's self-driving chief defending the safety record. So safety is something that people care about. The example I give is I have a daughter who is 17 years old who's currently learning how to drive in the streets of Pittsburgh, where, of course, there's a lot of hills, there's a lot of ice and things like that. So the question is, I'm not worried about privacy, I'm not worried about security, but what I am worried about is which is safer, having my daughter in a self-driving car or her driving the car herself at this 17, 18-year range. So I really do care about safety more than anything else as a mom. So I think a lot of people sort of think about that issue. So this is an analysis from Stanford, and the states in red are states which have decided to oppose and having self-driving cars in their state. The states in blue passed laws that allow self-driving cars. The states in yellow are thinking about it. So you can imagine that if you were driving from, say, Pittsburgh, or Pennsylvania up here, all the way to California, you'd have a pretty hard time today in a self-driving car. So what are you going to do about it? It's a challenge, and that's because state laws, or most motor vehicle laws, are state laws, they're not national laws. So right now, it would be a challenge, but we never hear about that. We never hear about the policies that might be a barrier. We just hear about the sort of cool stuff about a self-driving car. As another example of this, and just about a week or so ago, Uber decided they're going to have self-driving cars pick up passengers in Pittsburgh. In case you know, Uber formed a research center in Pittsburgh, stole a lot of our roboticists, it's an interesting idea. And I think, oh yeah, that'd be cool. Again, my daughter, you could drive her around when I'm out of town, but they immediately hit a barrier. So where it says PUC, ask for more information about Uber's plans, that's the Public Utility Commission in the state of Pennsylvania. They already got in trouble once for putting Uber in the first place. It took they got stopped for a while, had a bunch of negotiations. As I'm sure you guys know, they've had major problems in other countries. And then this is a Pittsburgh Business Times poll of business people saying, would you want to be hooked up in a driverless car? And the majority of people are saying no. And this video, I just encourage you to watch. It's on YouTube. It's one of my favorite videos. I use it in all my classes. It's called the Uber Wars. And it's about the discussion between the head of Uber and the DC City Council and the DC Taxi Commission. It's only about 11 minutes long. It is like so funny that it will teach you so much about interaction between Silicon Valley and places like DC, Pittsburgh, people in city government. So here's another example. This is something where you have technologies that are like thermostats and things like that are house-related technologies, where you want to be able to generate energy, sell that back to the grid. Well, there's a whole bunch of laws that regulate the grid. And right now, in particular, the utilities don't want to give up their business proposition of saying, okay, it's our job to sell the energy, and it's illegal for anyone else to sell it. So even though I might generate more energy than I need, I want to sell it to my neighbor. Right now, that's not really possible. So I just want to know that there are good things that public policy does. This is Acumen Energy. It's a Carnegie Mellon energy storage spinoff. It's for renewable electricity. So basically, when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, this battery stores energy. It's a saltwater-based battery. The researcher who developed it is Jay Whitaker, who is a professor at Carnegie Mellon. And this has gone from the laboratory to manufacturing in about 10 years. It's got major Silicon Valley investors in it. And why was it successful? Well, the reason here is because California and other states, as well as other countries, put in mandates. We must have so much energy storage by 2020. And as a result, a demand was created for that battery. And that led them to move from an idea in the lab to manufacturing to worldwide export and job creation because of this California law, as well as other states. But California is really the big one because of this 2020 requirement for so much energy storage. So let's switch to IoT and see what we have here. So this is a survey that was done of business people. And the question is, what do they see as the primary challenges of implementing IoT within their organization? The first one is the one everybody's familiar with, which is security and privacy concerns. The second one is the value assessment need for case studies, and organizational consensus. And I think that's a very important one. Right now, I don't think that most people are yet seeing the value proposition for many IoT devices. The third one is just lack of knowledge about available solutions. They don't really know what you can do with IoT because IoT is kind of a techie generalistic term. The next one is the need for infrastructure upgrades, and that doesn't include just physical infrastructure, but things like talent and, how is somebody going to fix this? Do we really, right now we don't have enough people when somebody's computer doesn't work. So what's going to happen when something like this goes down? Who's going to maintain it? Those very sort of fundamental core issues. And the last one is lack of standards, not interoperability, which I'm sure you guys are working on. And that is something which is, a key issue, but there's a lot of different ways to handle that within the structure. So here's some more data from the same survey. So the majority of the professionals are familiar with IoT, but they need more education. They need to know about how to be relevant and valued to the organizations, how to leverage it. They think they have positive views, like at least the majority of them think it is poised for significant growth. But they say, look, the same number roughly says there's also a lot of confusion surrounding IoT. Now, if you look at the next one, this is a study by Accenture, and this is focused on the public. So this is sort of focused on consumer technology. And you'll see here what people are looking at and buying and how that has changed over time. And as you can see, the percentages are not, particularly high. It's sort of like stabilized out quite a bit, and you're not sort of seeing that rapid growth that you want to see. So the question is why? So the first one is basically, is it worth the money? What I call, efficiency, economic efficiency. I understand this. I spent like money for my Amazon Echo. I still have not figured out how to use it other than to play music. But I'm sure that there's other things related to the house, but it's like really just hard for me to figure it out, to realize it worth my time and effort to change on my light bulbs and all these other kinds of things. So you'll see here, most people are finding it too expensive. They're concerned about privacy and security, but notice the expense is higher than privacy and security. They don't know what's useful for them, and they find them confusing. This is, again, security issues. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but basically, a lot of people are kind of waiting. Majority of people are waiting till they kind of understand things more. And then the next talks about like the ease of use being a barrier to adoption. So they just finding them a little bit too complicated. They have problems setting them up. It didn't quite work as advertised, those kinds of things. So where do policymakers come in here? Now, the way Uber has been able to maintain itself, even though there's been a fair amount of policymaker opposition, is because they had people in the field saying, hey, we really like Uber, right? So like in Pittsburgh, when they shut Uber down, then I got an email from Uber saying, write to your legislator and, save Uber. DC, it was sort of the same thing. So they have sort of a groundswell strategy in terms of how to respond to these non-market issues. And that has worked somewhat, and in some places has not worked in other places. That's why there are certain cities where Uber is banned, others where they've had riots, all sorts of different things. So if I'm a policymaker, these are sort of the 4 decisions I might make. If I think that the risk is greater than the rewards, I'm going to put in some sort of regulation, a precautionary regulation. So again, looking at the car as an example, in some of those states, you'll sort of see that happen. Well, I'm willing to have the car, but only if there's a driver in the seat who can override the system, right? So they're willing, to do it, but they want it regulated. Another option is we'll just like stay out of the way and let the market. That's sort of like what Pennsylvania has done. Pennsylvania, back on that map, has not decided whether or not to do anything on self-driving cars. I will tell you, CMU self-driving car drives around. Pittsburgh, one time I took a congressman from CMU to the airport And somebody said, is that legal? And nobody decided to answer that question. Then other people think, well, are the rewards greater than the risk? So like California, Michigan, so forth, they're thinking, hey, this is a good value proposition for us from a policymaker standpoint. We want to have the innovation here. So we're going to put in place the facilities and so forth to get it happen. And then you have people who are the super technology champions who said, hey, this is the way to go. And that is sort of what you want, where we think the rewards are so high, so great, that we're willing to take any risk at all. Now, some of that is going to vary depending on the economic conditions of each, say, state or city. It's also going to depend on just the degree of risk people are willing to take in that community. I will say that people in Pennsylvania, for example, are much more willing to take risk than, say, people in California. Just you can tell that by the laws and things that are in place. So what is a non-market strategy? So this is how you would address this if you were looking at it. So the first is you have issues. So I've outlined some of those earlier. Then you want to think about who the actors are. Who are the people who are influencing? And actors are not just policymakers, but people who influence policymakers. What their interests are, you think, where is this battle going to take place? Is it going to be at the local level, the state level? Is it going to be in a federal agency? These are things to think about. What information might make a difference? And then what assets do the actors have? For Google, for example, obviously has a major reputation. Its assets are different than, say, Ford or Volvo, right? Because they just have a different sort of vibe, for lack of a better word, when they're interacting with policymakers. So here's some examples of all the different kinds of actors that you might need to influence as you develop a public policy strategy. A lot of people think only of like the government and policymakers, but really all these other entities have a lot of influence too. When I was at the White House, for example, a blog would have perhaps a major effect. I was shocked, right? Who really think that somebody's opinion on a blog would make a difference? But that sometimes gets picked up, and before you know it, there you go. And so some things you can do is government interaction. So majority building strategies, that basically means, try to get a bunch of people to work with you. Informational strategies, try to better inform people. Representation strategies, this is more, finding somebody who has the insider entree and get them to represent it for you. Interacting with media, trade associations, and then the one that I think is very often not thought about, which is engineering design modification. So as an example of that, I'm going to talk about wind power. So everybody kind of loves wind power, but certain senators do not like wind power. And the reason why is because it can kill bats and birds. So, but there are engineering ways to get around that. So if, say, 10 years ago, the wind turbine companies had said, okay, well, what we know this is an issue, what could we do? And if they had built that into the device, then that might have prevented that problem in the first place, so that when environmental groups, non-governmental organizations, and so forth opposed it, they would say, okay, well, this is all the things we're doing, so that it gives opinion that it's being taken seriously by that. So these are just, I'm not going to go through all these, but basically, some is just putting them in the right place. Radar is my sort of favorite one. When a flock of birds is coming, they turn on the radar, shut down the radar detects them, then they shut down the turbines. There's like tracking devices. So I saw one story, like they have eagles and things like that fly around to do different things. Ultrasonic acoustics is something which I think is interesting. I did not know this, but birds are different than bats. So bats, you just don't want to know what happens to a bat around a wind turbine. All I can say is it's not a pretty story. So it's all related to sonics and things like that. So you have to understand what is. It's not just simply stopping them from flying. There's other things that are involved. And there's simple things like painting a turbine a different color, just so that it's more visible to the different creatures that are flying around. So in summary here, this is the why is an understanding of non-markets important? You need to have the sort of confidence in leadership. It affects your profitability, investor perception. I run a clean tech prize competition for the Department of Energy. And one of the reasons DOE funded it was because they found that when students are presenting their clean tech ideas, they don't know anything about policy, but the investors who are the judges know a lot about policy, and they were asking questions that the students couldn't answer. Competitor activities is important to know that just because you're Google, if a Tesla gets in an accident that kills somebody, then it's going to affect your reputation also. You're all in this together. And that is also not always recognized. Public buy-in and interest group buy-in. So I'm going to give you some examples of strategies. Now, these strategies, I'm going to give my strategy at the end, but I'm going to give other people's strategies first. This is, I will tell you my least favorite. This is from the Center for Data Innovation, which is part of ITIF. Let me see, which is the Information Technology Innovation Foundation. That's all right. And this is what they say. So I added the 4 policymakers in there. So this is what they said in a pretty recent report that policymakers should do. They should reduce regulatory barriers, minimize regulatory costs, and so forth. This is what I would call sort of a standard industry response. You policymakers, IoT is wonderful. We're going to bring lots of money and jobs, do things to make it better for us. And I don't think that strategy always works when a technology is at this stage. Now, the next strategy, and you guys can disagree with me, but this is just sort of my opinion. So this is from the Accenture report that I mentioned earlier, and I agree more with this one. So this one talks about offering a compelling customer value proposition. And right now, I don't think that's necessarily there, because you want to build up enough public support so that when something bad happens or you face a regulatory barrier, you have that support. Because in the end, a policymaker cares about their voters and getting those votes. The next is ensuring a superior customer experience. Again, there's things that can happen, building security and trust. These are things that, just a basic confidence issue. The other thing they have is talking about focusing on disruptive innovation. And that also, I think, is not necessarily happening in this area. There's lots of things that are kind of cool, but they're not things that necessarily a population can afford. So I think that is interesting. So you want to do things where people have more access to whatever the benefits are, in a place where maybe it's not costing them anything yet. And then think about sort of the full ecosystem. Think about all the different players and sort of working together and not just trying to do it on your own, because everybody's really in this together. Like I said, it doesn't make any difference who the company is that has a problem. It's going to affect everybody's reputation in the field. So this is another person's that I sort of liked. And I just did a couple of clips from this blog. So, and this is an investor, and saying is the Internet of Things the world's most confusing tech trend? It's supposed to be epic and so forth, but end users are saying it's essentially meh. It feels like an avalanche of new connected products that seem trivial, solving first world problems, expensive, nice to have, as opposed to must-haves. And right now, and in the article, he talks about how it relates to other trends that have occurred over time. And then, this is the other thing which I thought was a key point, which is it's largely at a point where the future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed. And it's sort of patchy, doesn't always look good, doesn't always work great. So I think it's sort of, as he says there, and for all the talk about a mega tech trend, it's moving at the speed of molasses with little discernible progress year after year. Oops. So the question here is like, what would I do if I was the head of Google IoT policy? The first thing I would do is I would try to find a new problem for IoT, something that would really engage a stakeholder, something that's a big societal problem. And I would do it something something that policymakers at the local and state level could afford. Now, I do not know what this is, but I do know that cities and states out there have a lot of problems, don't have a lot of money to solve those problems. And I seem to think that if you got enough Googlers in a room and actually talk to, people at the city, state level, and not just in California, I emphasize this, but in other, throughout the country in sort of key areas, that you can maybe come up with something where people could see the value of IoT. And like I said, I'm not really sure what it is. Is it something related to the homeless or hunger or, all these things that are out there? But I think that engaging with stakeholders to figure out like what the problems are and then thinking about IoT as opposed to first looking at IoT and then trying to find a problem is sort of key. The next thing is engaging with the workers in the field. And so we've, at my department, which is in engineering public policy, we have, say, psychologists who look at different things. And for example, they look at building energy efficiency. And what you find is that the way people decide to do certain things is because of their neighbors. Like if somebody puts solar panels on their house, then other neighbors are going to say, hey, I saw you put solar panels on your house. That's kind of cool. Or they'll, a building engineer will say, oh, I heard that you put in a new energy efficient windows. How did that work for you? So you need that community. As an example, I went and, so my house is relatively old. The garage door stopped working. And the guy said, okay, well, you need a new garage door. And I said, oh, I'd like to get one of those cool doors. I hear you can use a cell phone to open up the garage door, right? So definitely an IoT thing. He said, well, not necessarily a good idea. It's going to cost you like $800 more than a regular door. And you're going to have this problem and that problem. But you need that guy to be a missionary, right? He's the one who talks to all the people who are looking at all the garage doors and saying, this is a really good thing. Maybe give them some financial incentives to sell that door. So those people who are at the ground level, people like me get advice from, those are the people you need to influence. That, to put in that Nest thermostat instead of the thermostat they've been using for 1,000,000 years. Those maintenance workers, those people who really do the hardcore work, they need to be convinced. And the last one is engaging with kids. Okay, now this is, I also, by the way, before this I had kids and dogs, because kids and dogs I think are very influential, because that's sort of like how, how do you have a fire escape plan in your house? Well, they did it at school, lots of different things that happen. So I had proposed this for a while. I cannot convince my class when they looked at some of this stuff, because I teach a class on this every year. We take several companies and develop non-market strategies for them. But this is my idea. So my daughter, when she was young, used to go to Legoland. And what's the favorite thing to do at Legoland? Drive around in those little cars, right? I don't know if maybe you've never been to Legoland. Or Disney, Disney, you go and you drive around in these little cars. Well, what if those were autonomous cars? How many people go to these amusement parks and things every single year? A lot. And it kind of gives them some idea about what is it that we're talking about here. But something like that's a big visible demonstration that gets some positive media coverage, I think would be very useful. And I think I talked to some people and they said, well, it's going to be at a like some island or something. We're going to have one island that's going to be IoT central, and we're going to have driverless cars all over the island. Well, that's nice, but it's not going to influence a lot of people, even though it would be an interesting experiment. So I decided to go, I could focus on different devices and a strategy for each device. But as I thought more about this, I think it's sort of more of a big picture issue. It's sort of like when I looked at some of the data, the public data and things like that, I think that the key is to try to get enough people who support IoT devices in some fashion to make it so that when there is a public policy issue related to one device, you can say, oh, well, this happened and this happened. And, you'll have a case to make for a wonderful kind of thing just basically like Uber is doing for taxis, even though, again, I disagree with Uber's non-market strategy, but I will say that that part has been successful because they've had that groundswell of public opinion. Otherwise, they wouldn't be getting anywhere. So I wanted to give one example of this, which is not IoT, because I just came across this. So this is, I don't know, some person here that I think has a major role. And so this is sort of 100,000 lives are lost through fear of data mining. Probably because most people don't know what data mining is. So what he said here is, I think, a good illustration of what I'm talking about. He says, I think in some ways it's good that there's an open debate about it, and I think we needed it. There's been a lot of growth, and the area is trying to adapt to that growth, and that has been a concern. That dialogue and debate has not really happened with IoT activities. It's all been promotional, talking about the wonders and so forth, but there hasn't really been a true dialogue or debate other than to say, okay, we're working on privacy and security, but not all these other things. So that is it, and I'd be happy to answer your questions, and here's my email address if you're remote. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Well, I can start us off. Maybe I can use the mic so we get it on the recording.
You want this one?
So thanks, Deborah. I have a very practical question, and that is maybe a little bit detailed, but I'd be interested in your views of mediators or non-state actors like underwriters labs, ML, and certification, and what role they play. I don't know if you've thought about it, but there is a number of,
right.
There's competition, basically, regional competition. So the additional layer that I wanted to add to my question is the challenge of international business, which is already on the internet now. Some countries have data in their national spheres, which is rather difficult and contrary to the original design of the whole thing. And for the Internet of Things, people bring their stuff and their data, therefore their data moves across all different kinds of legislators. So I think it was a great analysis. But I have to say, for us, as we're thinking about this, some of the core questions are like, how the hell are we going to make this possible, not only here in the States, but on an international basis, and thinking about
and so the reason I didn't talk about that very much is, first, I kind of presume you were doing a lot in that space already. So within an hour, Pittsburgh is the Society of Automotive Engineers, and for that technology, they have a whole activity that's focused on developing standards for Internet of Things, which then is also working at the international level as well as the national level. So most of those activities are going to be a device by device standard setting activity, and they're going to go through the existing societies that do those activities. So I would say if I could do a whole thing just on, so standards would be an example of a non-market factor. And I think, what I would do is sort of like, it's pretty simple, sort of look at the device and see, are you doing something now already? Or probably even more importantly, is your competition doing something on it already? Because that is one way to get a market advantage, of course, is by making the standard such that it favors your device versus other devices. And so so I had my students do some analysis of again, just the cars only, not everything else. And I saw, quite a bit of activity, but then at least at that point, this is a couple years ago, Google was not involved with it. And I asked our CMU expert why, and they said, well, because CMU thinks that they're different. I mean, Google thinks that they're different and that they're not going to get necessarily an advantage from focusing on standards at that point, that everybody is so much in competition that they're not yet willing to work together. But in the end, sort of like I was talking about earlier, you have to work together. You have to, because the reputation of one affects the reputation of everybody. This is true, like in, say, shale gas. If there's one company that has an explosion, all companies are perceived to have the ability to have an explosion of one kind or another. So I think, so I do think standards are important, but the standards, doing standards is not that, I mean, it's hard to do the negotiations, mind you, but it's not very hard to figure out how to go through existing standards organizations. You just can't do it for everything. You disagree with that? You think it's hard?
Well, I think it's hard. It's a little bit slow, but it's clear
The
that it's
path is
working.
clear,
And
yes,
places like the Internet Engineering Task Force have done that successfully for a long time, keeping up with the speed. While one of the biggest problems with the policy and especially then the legal parts of this is that it's extremely slow. And it's almost outdated by the time that the law comes out. Right. So I think that's why I went more on the certification and that intermediate layer of underwriters lab and seals and that kind of
thing. So I think
it seems a little bit faster at least. I
mean, I think anything which is third-party certification is very useful. And I haven't seen it. I just always have been seeing, as you say, negotiated for a very long period of time. If you do it through private mechanisms, like something like Society of Automotive Engineers, Underwriters Laboratory, or things like that, some of which you have to pay for those things to occur. They don't naturally occur. Then you have a chance. I think the Department of Transportation has been kind of like working with agencies on that, but it's also a very challenging issue, for them. Because, as you say, things are changing super fast. And it really does involve, at this point, a requirement to do things at an international level. But there are international standards organizations. You just have to have people just kind of working on it. And you have to look at all. I just don't think that's possible to do it for everything that's IoT. I think you have to do it for device by device. If you're going to put in a thermostat, it's going to have to meet a certain ASHRAE certification or standard because that's what everybody looks at. Whatever that society is that has control over those things, that's who you have to work with.
I want to give others the possibility to also ask something, but any international organizations that you see with some expertise or have started interesting work in this space?
Well, I think I do, again, on the automotive side. I went and I spoke at an Internet of Things kind of activity that was in Austin. And they had a pretty active group that was working on international standards at that level. So I don't know all the standards organizations. I mean, the ISO, the International Standards Organization, is like obviously the biggest one, but there's also like many, many others too. So there are people who are sort of experts in standards of one kind or another. The other big agency in the United States is NIST, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology. They also work with the international organizations. So even though they're a U.S.-based agency, they do lots of different things. So like building code standards, fire standards, things like that. They also do those. So I think that there's plenty of places to work. It's just deciding which one to go with, and in terms of speed and
there's
cost.
Too many. You wanted to say there's too many.
Well, yes, that's another way to say it is too many. To do it. But I do think it's critical. But I don't think it solves the core problem, which is part of the reason that the speed at which a standards organization work is also directly related to its market activity, right? So that if it really, as they're saying now, we're going to have cars on the road in the next year or two, last I knew it was like 2020 or something like that, then things will get speeded up because policymakers will say, hey, we want them and we want them now. And that's, again, so in the end, policymakers still influence the speed with which standard organizations work.
If you're interested, I've been a member of the Internet Governance Forum and that multi-stakeholder governance activities, and there is an Internet of Things dynamic coalition that follows the right approach, but is not necessarily center stage for.
Well, yeah, that's why. Because in the end, like I said, the challenge with those, because I definitely know about all those standards organizations that are sort of floating around, but they're, in my opinion at least, they're too general. And in the end, if I'm a person, if I'm like, I don't know, a person who's a building manager, and I'm deciding whether or not to put Nest thermostats throughout my entire building, that's not the place I'm going to go to figure out what to do, right? I'm going to go to ASHRAE, which is, let me see, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and something or another, right? There's certain organizations, there's like IEEE standards, right? Those have a lot of visibility, but that's why I talked about you have to go to the customer, right? So, too much, at least what I see is it's at such a high level that doesn't get to the people at the ground level. So what you really want to do is go to the Association of Maintenance Engineers or something like that. I'm sure there's something of that realm, and say, okay, well, if we were going to put in a standard, what standard organization would you have confidence in? Right. You see, that's the question. It's not, you need to go, I guess that's kind of like the overall point I'm trying to make. So much of what I see in the IoT space is from the top down, and it really needs to be from the bottom up. And the only way you can figure out like how, what the best devices are to use, how to do standards, everything else, is by talking to the people on the ground and getting them to dialogue with your engineers who are working on this stuff and say, okay, well, what do you guys think? And listen more than talk, right? Like, what problem do you have? And then you can go back and think, oh, well, is there anything that we could do to solve this problem? Like if there was, like, I'll give another example. So like in the energy space, one of the big problems is that in a building, particularly these older buildings, there's not individual meters, right? So if you're not paying for your own energy, then you have no real incentive to reduce your energy. Just like when you're in a hotel, right? If you're in a hotel, you're already paying the cost of the room. You could go and turn on the air conditioner full blast, turn the heat, whatever it is. You don't care because you're not paying for it, right? Hopefully you care about the environment and so forth, but just to say this is not really an issue, you're just cold. Right? Right. Okay, well, but the thing is that from the owner's perspective, they're not getting any sort of real benefit either. They can't control you, right? They can't do anything. Now, what if there was a device that instead for an older apartment building was able to meter, how much energy was used in each different apartment? So therefore, the person who owns the building could say, oh, well, the person who is using the most energy is the person in apartment 222. And they're using 2 or 3 times as much as everybody else. We need to talk to them, or we need to put this in as a requirement, within our policies. Or so, there has to be some sort of enforcement mechanism to it. Now, that's a problem that maybe a lot of people have, and but I don't necessarily see that. Like if you're saying to the person, okay, well, buy Nest thermometers for every single place in the building, they're going to say, oh, that's too expensive, too much work, too much to maintain. I'm going to have to teach everybody how to use it, so on and so forth. But if you could figure out a way to kind of gather that same information and so you can manage the building better, then, you have some hope, right? Then you are solving a problem that somebody actually has. And right now, that's not what, at least I'm saying. I'm not, it's something cool, but it's not sufficiently cool, like say my phone, that solves a problem of like keeping track of my kid, right? To really entice a lot of people to say, oh, I'm going to make that investment over some other activity.
Thanks, everyone.